I am Doug White with Cutting Edge Enterprise. It's Paul went to the Halloween store, and this is what happens. So we can't take him anywhere. This is why we have machetes laying on the desk, but we have them. I'm Doug White, and this is Enterprise Security Weekly. I'm filling in for Paul. I'm joined by Matt Alderman, the amazing guy. We're going to talk about a whole bunch of stuff, but we primarily are going to talk about audit IT mistakes that we see in enterprise all the time when we're doing auditing. So I think that's where we are. Cisco aims to make security. What is this? Oh, I'm sorry. This is excuse me. Cisco aims to make security foundational throughout its business. Fidelis looks to grow cybersecurity platform. How artificial intelligence can improve human decision-making in IoT apps. Crossmatch announces the availability of digital persona version 3.0 and video fingerprinting. So stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly.
I'm a tiger. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly. I don't know how this is going to go because Paul's not here this week, but we're just going to give it a shot.
Even if you've got experience in security, you can benefit from going to somewhere and learning about that bug again. Wearing my tactical turtleneck just for Mr. John Strand, who is on the lines via Skype. John, welcome to the program.
I'm wearing the tactical fleece as well, Paul. This is
Excellent.
A fully, completely, and utterly tactical show.
Are you an enterprise dissatisfied with overpriced analytics software that can't keep up with modern data? If so, then GravWell is the solution for you. GravWell is an unstructured data analytics platform for enterprises who demand total data visibility across their network. GravWell lets your security team go beyond the SIM and fuse data sources to correlate and answer questions you didn't know needed to be asked. Go to gravwell.io/Security Weekly for an unlimited data trial and gain uncompromising visibility today. Improve the efficiency and effectiveness of your security operations with DF Labs security orchestration, automation, and response technology. Automate threat containment, orchestrate incident response, and measure operational performance with DF Labs in-command SOAR platform. Leverage your current security resources to minimize incident resolution time, maximize analyst efficiency, increase the number of incidents handled, and reduce overall risk. In-command SOAR acts as a force multiplier, enabling your security team to do more with less. Streamline the full incident response lifecycle automation process today. Keep your cybersecurity incidents under control with DF Labs. Visit dflabs.com/Security Weekly and request to see in-command SOAR live in action. Effectively securing your organization and its reputation requires a smarter approach. To maximize efficiency and minimize risk, security experts turn to Logarithm, the only leading solution built solely for security teams by a security team committed to your success. With next-gen SIM, user and entity behavior analytics, network traffic and behavior analysis, security automation and orchestration, and compliance, Logarithm provides security made smarter. Stop attackers from domain credential theft and lateral movement with a 99% success rate by using artificial intelligence to control the attacker's perception of the environment. Javelin Networks is the world's first endpoint intrusion containment platform to protect domain networks. Javelin detects targeted attacks and breaches by obfuscating Active Directory, domain controllers, domain identities, domain credentials, and all domain resources. It only takes one compromised machine to jeopardize the entire organization. Don't be a victim. Visit javelin-networks.com and request a demo of AD Protect today. Are you worried about PCI compliance? Does your development team understand or care about security? Are you ready to face a breach of your customer sensitive data? See the worst that can happen before it does. Black Hills Information Security can help you help management see the future. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to find out how a web application penetration test can mitigate the risk before you go live.
Welcome to episode 107 of Enterprise Security Weekly for September 19th, 2018. I'm your host, Doug White. I'm joined by the amazing Mr. Matt Alderman. Matt, hi.
Hello. 2 weeks in a row for me.
2 weeks in a row for you. Okay, well then you get a special prize for that. Like, I don't know, some Halloween toy or something we'll send you in the mail. Maybe a dismembered hand or something like that. Be sure and join us for our webcast with Logarithm about tips and tricks for defending the enterprise using open source tools. That webcast will be held September 27th at 3 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So make sure you register right now at securityweekly.com/logarithm. DerbyCon is holding its first ever mental health and wellness workshop. Wow. To help support their efforts, please go to derbycon.com/wellness. You should support their efforts. That's a really good thing. So, Matt and I are going to talk about big-time audit mistakes that we see, and we see lots of them all the time. And I thought that was a pretty interesting and germane topic for us to get into. One of the things, I think that my theme of it was my biggest audit mistake that I see is making the mistake of getting into the mindset of just ticking the box. Like, when you start assuming that the audit is just something you have to accomplish rather than something that's supposed to guide you, you basically have defeated the whole point of the audit, and you're just wasting your money, because now you're saying, whatever it takes to tick this. And I've had people say that to me, Doug, whatever it takes to tick that box, let's do it. We're going to do it. We're going to fix it. I'm like, wait. You know, just telling me okay and ticking the box. And I've even had people to say, could you just tick that box? Well, I don't know. What do you think, Matt?
I think this is one of the core challenges when regulations and compliance came into the mix, not only for the audit, but for security just in general, right? We treated it initially as a checkbox exercise. Everybody said, okay, I need a vulnerability scanner, I need a log management solution, I need FIM, I need blah, 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 right? So as security practitioners back then, we went out, we bought a bunch of these solutions to meet the compliance requirements, because we knew audit was going to come in and look at the same boxes and go, yeah, you got a vuln scanner. Yep, you've got a log management solution. Yep, you've got file integrity monitoring. And I think that's a big mistake. And I think over the years, we've seen that, you know, compliance doesn't necessarily mean you're secure. And so don't take that approach, both from a compliance perspective, security, and your audit. Really think about what is it that you're trying to achieve in your audit, and think about it a little differently than just a bunch of checking the boxes.
Right. I mean, I was trying to tell people you need to do this stuff not because the rules require it, but because it makes sense. And I mean, there's always stuff in audit that I think is, you know, you have to decide what the balance is between, you know, reasonable and ridiculous. But when it's really just all about how do I tick this box, and it says we need a vulnerability scanner, so we went and bought one, and here it sits, and I say, do you know how to work it? Do you use it? Do you actually do anything with it? And they're like, it just said we needed one. I mean, I had somebody say that, you know, I'm like, so who's doing the vulnerability scans, and when do they do them, and what were the results? And they're like, oh, well, you didn't tell us we had to do that, you know. And it's just like, okay, I'll add another box you can tick. You know, did you do the vulnerability scan? Did you read the log? Did you read the report? Did you take action? And then they're like, yeah, now we've got a whole bunch of additional stuff. So you get a bunch of grief about that.
In the early part of my career, one of the things I used to do on the consulting side was, you know, go in and help organizations build their security programs, right? And the first thing you do is you walk in and you'd ask for their policy. Mm-hmm. Because think about it, right? What is the auditor validating? They're validating against your policy. And what had happened in some of the early days of security is people just grabbed every single control, didn't matter, and threw it into a big policy document. And I used to come into these organizations and I go, this thing's huge. Can you even deploy all these different controls in your policy? And I said, you got to think about this a little bit differently, right? What is driving this policy? What's your regulatory requirements, right? Are you Gramm-Leach-Bliley? Are you HIPAA? Are you PCI, et cetera? Use that as your starting point and start to build your policy, because the first thing the auditor is going to do is ask for your policy, and then they're going to go through your policy to see if you do all those things. And I just used to go into organizations and they just had crazy, crazy long policies because they thought, well, I'll just throw everything in the kitchen sink in there and I'll be good. No, you're going to get audited against everything in the kitchen sink you just threw into your policy.
No, the first time I got involved in that was when Sarbanes-Oxley was just coming online, and I was a consultant to a company that was working with a large auditing firm, and they basically didn't know what to do. So I had foolishly, in my naivete, I had a printed copy of ISACA, of the COBIT guidelines. So I had the ISACA, COBIT volumes 1 through 75 or whatever of that thing. And I took that with me to New York, and I said, I want to show you this, because they were actually asking me, what do they mean? They say we need to have good hygiene or whatever. And I said, well, here's a place to start looking. And then literally 6 weeks later, here come these like junior auditors back, and they go, so we have a checklist of every item from the COBIT. And I'm like, what? And you're going to try to impose that on someone? Like, well, get ready to kiss your business goodbye. And they're like, no, you told us. And I'm like, I told you it's a thing to look at. And I couldn't, and it took a long time of beating on people. And then even then, it was really hard to get them around the mentality of, there's a box here, it says you need to have this and this thing. And it was kind of like, well, what is this control, and why are you using it? And is it really for you? And it was really tough to get people around that, and even to understand, what does it control? It was like, we need a control, and I'm like, okay, and the control is we say we do it. So, and then we started testing them on it, because I would get them and they would say, oh, we have a control for user management, and it's like, okay, and how do you do that? And they're like, oh, they didn't say that you were going to look at it. I mean, it was the first response I got, so it was kind of goofy. But so I put down some stuff that I've seen a lot, that I felt like that was some of the biggest things that I saw over and over again that were real flaws in people's audit approaches and security approaches from that. And my first one was, and Matt's going to add some too. My first one was, how do you manage changes in status, especially like with Active Directory and all these kind of overarching control systems? I kept seeing over and over again, I would go in and I would look at it, and they would say, yeah, we use Active Directory. And it's like, okay, that's great. And I'm like, how do you manage all these objects? So there's thousands and thousands of objects. How do you manage an object? So when Chris resigns, how does the objects Chris has access to get updated so that Chris no longer has control of those objects? And they're like, what? I mean, it was like, and I saw that so many times where they couldn't even begin to describe the objects, for one thing. And the second thing was, they could not even begin to tell me how they managed a user exit, like a separation is the term that they like to use. And how do you get a user who dies, who retires, who gets fired, who quits, from they just called down and said, I quit. I'm mad as hell and I can't take it anymore. I'm out of here. To that person no longer has access to these hundreds of objects they have administrative access to. Have you seen that one, Matt? I'm sure you have.
Oh, yeah. I mean, identity and termination of employees. And this kind of also goes into one of the other ones, which is file shares, right? The other thing you see just major abuse of, and a challenge to get your arms around from an audit perspective, is who has access to all these shares. And so when you think about termination of an employee, it's not only their identity and their access, but how does that trickle through the entire organization and limit things down? Because if those accounts don't get removed, now you've got all these extra shares that have access that may not need access anymore. This also works when, the same issue here is when people change jobs, they change their role. Maybe it's not even a termination, right? They were in one group, now they get a job change and they're in another group. So instead of removing their old role, they just add the new role. Yep. And so you get this role expansion, not only in privileges, but potentially in file shares and all this other stuff. And those are really hard things for the auditors to get their arms around, because it creates extra privileges that may not need it to be in the environment.
I mean, I saw that a lot, and that was very common, because in fact that one is a big threat, because the people haven't left, so they're still there. There's still a person named Cheryl Barnes or whatever in the company, and yeah, they moved from being vice president of marketing to vice president of something else, and they still have all their rights and privileges, and we'll take those out next week, because they didn't want to give them up even. So when we went in and looked at them, a lot of these people were like, "Oh, well, I'm still doing part of that job, and I haven't really, I'm just transitioning. I need to stick with this, and for a while, I still need that access and this other access over here." And the other one that we found to be a dire threat. Well, actually, there was two. They're all dire threats. There were two. One was retirees. They would get these people who would retire, and they kept logging into the systems. Not even maliciously, but they were just logging in and doing stuff because I saw one once, and this guy was logging in every week, and he'd been retired for a year and a half, and he's logging in, he's making changes to stuff, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I'm just riding herd on some stuff that's still going on, and I always log in and check to see that my replacement's still doing, crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's," and I'm like, "You don't work here. Like, we're calling you because you're in the system and you don't work here." And he's like, "I know, but I'm helping out wherever I can." And it's just like, you don't work here. And then the other one, of course, was terminations. And it's really tough because they had people they wanted to terminate, and they didn't want to disable their privileges because that gives them a big tip. Like, if you can't get in the system, you're like, "Oh, did I just get fired?" It's like, "Yes, you did." But you really don't want them in there when they get notified, because a lot of people especially people who are very dangerous people like IT people and security people, when they would get notified, they may have scripts already written to do bad things. It was really tough to manage that change process. We did this with the tool I was using, and this was a while ago, was called Dump ACL, or Dump ACL was how I think the Microsoft people said it. And it just literally went through and dumped a massive document of objects and object privileges into a text file, which I then had to write scripts to go through and parse to try to pull out and tease this stuff out. How did you audit this, Matt? I mean, did you have an auditing strategy for this stuff?
It varied. I mean, obviously, identity and access management systems and Active Directory and all those systems were always in play here. And it got tough, right? Because you had user access in various systems. I think it's a little better now than when I was doing this back in my consulting days. Some things are a little more centralized, a little more easier to manage. But, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when I was doing this stuff, I mean, you would have to look into all these systems and figure out, okay, who's this person? Why do they still have access to these different services or accounts or whatever? It was challenging back then.
It was. It's probably. I think it's challenging today too. There are a lot more automated tools. There's like live tools and things that are running in the system, and there's definitely more documentation of maybe good ways to do this. But it's still incredibly challenging because of the volume of objects that exist and the volume of users that exist. I mean, if you've got an enterprise. One of the ones I audited, they had more than 30,000 employees worldwide, and every one of those people had rights and privileges. And of course, for every employee, there was 10 objects that existed, whether it was a printer or a file share or something. And all those things need to be managed, and they need to be managed all the time. And every time something changed, and there was not a day went by in that company that somebody didn't change roles, somebody didn't quit, somebody didn't get hired. And, it was just like a constant ripple of change through that. And they were not able to I mean, it was early. I'm sure they do a better job now, but it was very early for them to try to figure this out. And they just never had a good system for doing it, because in the mainframe days, everything was in one place. But now it's scattered across domain controllers, and it's scattered across forests and all these things. And it was really, really complicated. Do you have a big one you want to put in? A mistake?
The next one?
Yeah, let's do another one.
So one of the areas that I spent a lot of time in was on third parties. And one of the fun ones that, I used to manage third-party vendor management for one of the large national banks back when I was in Cleveland. And, it's challenging to think about the 70,000 vendors that the bank had. And the mistake that was made was the assumption of who you audited was all based on revenue size. But those weren't your highest risk third-party vendors. It was all your mom and pops, right? Because if you think about some of the large service providers, even back then, this would have been the early 2000s as part of Graham Leach Bliley and a lot of the work that I was doing in the GRC space back then, the larger third parties actually had pretty good security programs. It was all these little mom and pops.
Yep.
That had access to super critical data that had no controls. Think of the Clinton email server joke, right? In the back room of some little office, right? That existed even back then, and probably still today to some extent for the banks. They would have social security numbers of their wealth management customers getting printed on statements by just little shops that had no security controls in place. So the assumption of who was the most risky in your third parties had nothing to do with the size of the third party or how much you were spending with them. You really needed to think about it more from a who has good controls, who doesn't have good controls, and what kind of data do they have. So I spent a lot of time revamping kind of the third-party audit program, really to think about the different levels of risk based on what the third party had access to, so that we could go out and do a really good risk assessment and then figure out how to audit these firms and really look for those lacks of controls where critical data might just be completely exposed of the customer base.
Yeah, I like that one a lot, because I've seen that many times too, where you've got I mean, I worked for some people where they had hundreds of vendors who now were sharing database information across all the platforms. So I've got a database, you've got a database, we link them together, we do queries together, we allow all these queries to go across the internet. And yeah, those little small vendors that were providing you with paper towels still have access to all your systems. And one of the things I saw going on there was, in order for these queries to be read, so the vendor had to be able to send queries to the big company, and the big company had to be able to send queries to the vendor. And the person who set it up just basically turned it on like world writable. Because it was like, and I talked to the guy and he was like, well, I didn't know how to fix it. I was never trained on those systems. I just was told to get it up and working because it wasn't working. So we added some permissions. And I was like, you mean you added like all permissions? And he was like, well, I added 777 permissions. And I was like, yeah, that's all permissions. And he was like, well, you can call it that. Yeah, I guess. And I'm like, so you didn't think that was a problem? Because they got attacked and somebody was writing stuff into these directories and they were overwriting database files. So I think that's a really big problem. That was the DHS thing about the energy, the SCADA energy attacks that went on. All of that originated from attacks on small vendors, which escalated to the big vendors because they were trusted. So they couldn't get
even the Target breach, right? Was a small HVAC company that kind of got in, right? So a lot of people forget about all those third-party relationships. It's not just about auditing your internal systems. There's a whole exposure externally, because you give these vendors access to your systems, you give them access to your data. There's a whole huge risk set of criteria sitting over there that, if you don't think about it, it could blindside you. And it has created some of these attacks for others in the industry.
Okay, I agree. I've seen that many times. And so my next one was asset control. So one of the things that I kept running into was, we would talk to people about, okay, so you got these laptops and you've got 6,000 of them across the company, and we're going to upgrade them all this year. And so Dell, and no problem with Dell sends us 6,000 new laptops, and we take the old 6,000 laptops and what do we do with them? And our academic sort of oriented world was like, well, you take them and you wipe the hard drives, and and then you take the platters out of the drives and you shatter them into little pieces and you burn them in an incinerator and you salt the earth. And the response from management was, do you realize how much time that's going to take? And it became a big problem. But we see that over and over again. And when you do dump, whether it's dumping paper, it's dumping hard drives, it's dumping flash drives, it's dumping old magnetic tapes or anything else, over and over and over again, I have seen people doing this. I used to buy hard drives all the time on eBay. I would buy these like 24 and 36 boxes of hard drives. And, probably half the time they would still have data on them because they didn't wipe them, or they wiped the first two, and then the next 34 of them were like just full on. I was getting all kinds of interesting stuff off those drives. Same thing with phones. Now that you got mobile devices, you've got all those things you've got to wipe. And this became a big problem in audit, because when we started looking at this, one, it got a very negative response from management, who was saying this is going to cost us a fortune. And two, it was a huge issue for those companies.
Always fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was tough, right? I mean, it cost a lot of money, and it was easier to try to sell some of those devices off, but you still had to wipe them clean. But yeah, not many.
Yeah,
people
we finally, like in the second round of audits, they were just saying, we're just going to warehouse them. So they were just putting them on pallets and shrink wrapping them and putting them in a warehouse, and said, we don't know what to do and we can't afford to hire a giant warehouse full of people to wipe all these things. So we're just going to put them in the warehouse with shrink wrap on them. And I'm like, well, I guess that's good as long as nobody can go in the warehouse and get them. And, you got a CFO's laptop laying there on a pallet. In fact, we went and audited the warehouse. And when I went in the warehouse, I found there was somebody had torn the shrink wrap and taken some laptops out of there. And I was like, where did these go? And they're like, oh, somebody probably just wanted to use one of them for something. And I'm like, okay, who did that belong to? And how do you track that? And do you know that laptop is out there? My third problem I put on here was backups. I went after people so much on backups all the time because I always went in and looked at their backup setup, and and everybody had backups, and I never ever audited anybody that didn't have backups. Everybody that I asked is, what's your backups like? Oh, it's like we spent $1 million on this backup array, and then you look at it and you go, have you ever restored? That was one of my questions, and the answer was, what do you mean? And I'm like, have you ever restored a backup to see if it worked? And we caught somebody once in their backup system, the read heads didn't work. And the system they were using was no longer manufactured, and they could not find a unit that would actually read their backup material. And I was like, so you have backups that are not usable. I also saw people that had restores that didn't work. They didn't have protocols for restores. They didn't have policies for restores. They had no idea how to actually restore data. It was just we have backups. And of course, the other one being out of band. So one of my things is always out of band. Are you taking your backups and are you putting them somewhere else? And we just had another hurricane in North Carolina, and there's all these businesses that are sitting there with 8 feet of water in their equipment. And I'm like, where were your backups? And a lot of times when we went through those scenarios with people, they were saying, well, they're down the hall in that, and I'm like, so if this part of the building collapses, will that part collapse too? And it's like, well, yeah, but that's probably not going to happen, and it's like, You ever do any backup audits?
I used to build disaster recovery plans.
Oh, so you've seen all this.
Yeah, the last one I built was in 2006 for the Alliance Refinery that sat on the delta of the Mississippi River, which was hit by Hurricane Katrina. And I'm pretty sure, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm pretty sure it was my disaster recovery plan that was invoked. Because if you know how those plants run, they don't change systems very often, which means they were probably running the same systems, probably doing the same backup rotations and moving the tapes up north to the recovery facility that we had identified back then in the day. So yeah, I've seen these before, right? With cloud, it gets a little interesting because now a lot of people are doing stuff into the cloud and doing backups and stuff there, but you still have a lot of backup tape rotations, offsite facility storage that still has to happen for the on-premise environments. So yeah, I used to build those disaster recovery programs, so I used to get them audited on the other side.
Well, yeah, I guess it should make you feel bad that I feel the same way because I had a client like that too, also Katrina, who got hit, and I actually called them later. I was like, so did it work? Did it work what I told you? And then they were like, oh, it was a disaster. And I was like, oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I shouldn't sound so joyous that what I told you. But that was one where they had, it was both what I call the hot site conundrum, which is we have a warm site. And it's like, well, have we ever been out there? I mean, I had a client who told me they had a hot site, and I was like, can we go visit it? And they're like, oh, I don't know. I don't think anybody's actually able to go over there. I'm like, then that's not a hot site. But we had revised what they did because one of the problems they had was that they couldn't get to their hot site when a hurricane was coming because one of the plan was that we'll get in a helicopter and we'll fly there. I was like, you're going to get in a helicopter during a hurricane and fly out? And I was like, what kind of helicopter is this? And they were like, oh, I don't know. We'd have to make arrangements with some charter firm. And I'm like, okay, yeah, but we had to change some of that. And then when they actually had the issue, I was like, did it work? And he was like, oh, yeah, I did. Everybody got in, they got in the Humvee and they drove there in, the 4 hours and got it up and running. So I definitely have seen that with that. I always had a lot of trouble with hot sites and people doing that because they always tell you they have a hot site or they'll call it a warm site. And you say, can we go? And you go look at it. And it's like, there's nothing there. It's an empty warehouse. It's like, does this place even have power? and they're like, oh yeah, I think we can get that turned on pretty quick, and I'm like, during a total catastrophe. So did you do a lot of hurricane ones? I mean, you did a lot of DRPs, so.
I did some DRPs, primarily, hot and warm sites. And the challenge was they're expensive. If you got to build your own warm site or even a hot site, think about all the synchronization of data across those links. In Cleveland, there were a couple large financial institutions, some large insurance companies there. So obviously it made sense for them to make those investments, but they were really expensive. I remember debating the cost of the links between the data center and the warm or hot site, and the cost associated with how often could you synchronize data. I mean, these are super expensive plans. I think the cloud has made it easier now, where you can put stuff into other storage, lower cost storage, and have it available to you and distribute it within Amazon's regions. But if you have to build your own, these are really tough things to do.
And it gets to that. I mean, I love the transparency the cloud provides, because it means that an employee or me can take their laptop, switch to their phone, switch to another laptop or a desktop, and all that stuff's just kind of seamlessly following you along. And when I log into it, whatever it is. But that also means that auditing all that stuff becomes a huge problem as well, because now there's so many systems and there's so many pieces of all those systems that are floating around. But it certainly makes setting up a hot site a lot easier than it used to be, where you're having to say, we have to mirror all of our equipment and we have to pull all that equipment. We have to have a duplicate of that sitting somewhere else, and that equipment has to be working. It has to be syncing. And there really wasn't. I mean, the last time I audited one of those, there was no cloud kind of scenario. They had to sort of build their own, VPN constant update thing, none of which they had. They were telling me they had it. They called it a hot site, and the management loved to say hot site, and they would talk about the hot site all the time. And we went to the hot site, and I'm like, yeah, but none of these systems are even turned on. They're sitting here cold, and they haven't been updated. So how are you going to put what you're currently doing on the hot site, and how fast will that be? Because they had already told me their time horizon was they didn't need to be down more than an hour. And I'm like, okay, so when you switch to the hot site, how does that work exactly? And management's like, well, let's just rest assured that it does, and it's like, well, I'm sorry, but I can't actually do that. So I know we could talk about that all day, but we're going to run out of time. Matt and I can talk about this forever, but so as we wrap up this segment, check out some of our on-demand material that is previously recorded webcasts that are now available on demand at securityweekly.com/on-demand, and we'll be back with the enterprise security news in a moment.